Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue, over on his channel, will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team-up that we do once a week. And this week, it's a big one. It's a big one, Roger. It's Fantastic Four, Volume 1. The whole first run of the Fantastic Four, which ran from 1961 until 1996, when it was canceled for that ridiculous Heroes Reborn nonsense. But that was a pretty good run for a comic book. Of course, it was brought right back for Heroes Reborn, which was canceled, I think, 12 issues later or something, and then brought back with another Fantastic Four series. And it's kind of gone on like that. Fantastic Four was canceled once by Marvel Comics out of spite because Marvel didn't have the rights to do a Fantastic Four movie. Fox did. And so they said, screw it, we're just going to cancel the comic book. Ah! But it was brought back eventually. But we are talking about the first run of the Fantastic Four. So I have a project, my Marvel Master Plan, where I am reading every first run of every major Marvel comic book. Even some of the not so major ones I'll get to. I'll get to Moon Knight eventually, Roger. I started with Thor. I read every issue of Thor from the first run of Thor. And that was tremendous fun. And then I moved on to the Fantastic Four. And I've been reading the Fantastic Four for a long time. I've read it almost every day for a while. Not every day, but almost. It's taken me longer to do the Fantastic Four because I was reading a bunch of other comic book stuff at the same time. But yeah, I've read a lot of Fantastic Four, and I've really, really enjoyed it. Overall, this series has been really good. It's had its ups and downs. Had one particular bad spot the Fantastic Four did, which I'll, of course, go over. I'll talk about the highlights of this series and my thoughts on it. Starting with the very beginning. So Fantastic Four, created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. This comic book ushered in the Marvel Universe. This was really the start of the Marvel Universe as we know it. And after this, they came out with Thor and Spider-Man and a ton of other great characters, the Hulk, Iron Man, the Avengers eventually. The great Marvel Universe. And when I was growing up, I was a Marvel kid. And I loved these comic books. And so the iconic first issue of Fantastic Four, there's the cover. And this came at a time when Marvel, which wasn't quite Marvel yet, was doing a lot of monster comic books, which I loved. I love their old monster comic books. But Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were doing a bunch of monster comics. And there's a lot of that monster DNA in these early Fantastic Four issues, as you could just see from the cover. And Stan Lee wanted to do something different with this comic. He didn't want it to be the kind of comics that the Distinguished Competition was coming out with. He wanted to make this comic book different. And so he came up with a superhero team that had no secret identities. And initially, for the first couple issues anyway, didn't have costumes. And so they were already different because of that. But also, they didn't always get along, unlike the Justice League. The Justice League was a big hit, which is why Fantastic Four happened. But this was a very different team than the Justice League. My partner on Epic Comic Book Wednesday, Steve Donoghue, on his video will, of course, mention the Stan Lee virus, which infected all of comic bookdom, which was the introduction of real-world problems into comic books. Problems and consequences and things like that in the stories. And he will lament that fact. But it was revolutionary. And it made these stories really interesting and fun and relatable. And yeah, it was something that I think comic books needed, frankly. And these initial stories by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby are just tremendous fun. Of course, they did get costumes. The readers demanded that they get costumes. And so they did, starting with the third issue. Another iconic cover. And it's awesome. They're in their flying bathtub, the Fantastic Four car. And here in this issue they get costumes, they get the Baxter building, which is their headquarters for a long time before Doctor Doom destroyed it. It's a cool issue. This is the one where they fight the Miracle Man. And so these initial issues are tremendous fun, and then we get the issue where Doctor Doom, the greatest villain in the Marvel Universe, shows up. See if we find the cover to that. Yeah, the introduction of Doctor Doom. Yeah, just an amazing villain. And yeah, definitely one of the greatest villains, if not the greatest villains in all of comic bookdom. And it's awesome. These stories were tremendous fun. And these stories, as good as they are, were not as good as Jack Kirby and Stan Lee got on the Fantastic Four. Jack Kirby's artistic style was developing quite a bit around this time. And so by the time we get to the issue 33, which starts in this collection, his art style had really started to change. So by the time we do get to the Galactus story, we also get the Inhumans. The Inhumans were awesome. By the time we get to these later issues, he was doing some of the best work of his career. I really think some of these Fantastic Four issues were some of his best work. And then we get Galactus, and we get the Silver Surfer, one of Jack Kirby's greatest characters. And yeah, these issues are legendary with Galactus. There's Galactus first arriving on the scene. The Fantastic Four's adventures just kept getting bigger, and some of the most interesting characters in comics you got in the Fantastic Four. A lot of great characters first showed up in the Fantastic Four, like the Black Panther first showed up in the Fantastic Four, Silver Surfer, the Inhumans, so many great characters. Wyatt Wingfoot became a character around this time in the Fantastic Four. So Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, they were fantastic. And of course, it was the world's greatest comic magazine. You know, they proudly proclaimed that on every issue's cover. So of course, it had to be true. It had to be true, Roger. And it was true, in my opinion. The Fantastic Four is my favorite Marvel comic. So this project has been a lot of fun, obviously. And they were on this comic together, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, for a long, long time. And like I said, Jack Kirby did some of his greatest work. And these are the foundational issues of the Fantastic Four. Everything that came after really owes a lot to this run of the Fantastic Four. And Jack Kirby was on the Fantastic Four for around 100 issues before he left. He actually left Marvel Comics. And unfortunately, Jack Kirby's last few issues of the Fantastic Four were not his best. They weren't terrible, but you could tell he was just kind of phoning it in by the end, unfortunately. And issue 101 was it for, issue 102 was it for Jack Kirby. And then in issue 103, he was gone, and John Romita was brought in temporarily. And I like John Romita a lot, but his Fantastic Four was good, but I don't know. It wasn't Jack Kirby's Fantastic Four. Fortunately, John Buscema, one of the greatest comic book artists of all time, was brought in. And John Buscema took the Fantastic Four into the 1970s. And the Fantastic Four was a lot of fun in the 1970s. But before going into the 1970s, let's just talk a minute about some of the interesting things that did happen in Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's run that were kind of unique. Aside from just having real world problems, the relationships with the characters were always fascinating because they were not an ordinary superhero team, because they were not like just a group of adventurers that came together to fight crime. They were a family, basically. And that was clear from the very beginning. And they fought like members of a family, and they behaved like members of a family. And they continued to do so, which was one of the most interesting things about the comic. And Reed Richards and Sue Storm got married. The Invisible Woman and Mr. Fantastic got married. And had a child. Which was, a complication in a comic book. Because now you have a married couple with a child while you go out and have these incredibly dangerous adventures and supervillains are literally attacking you all the time, So that was an interesting thing. The characters developed really well under Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. The Thing, who initially in Stan Lee's mind would be kind of a villain. You never knew when he was going to snap and just become a villain. But he ended up being the most popular character. And so he couldn't be a villain, So that idea was tossed quite early. The Thing is probably, in my mind, the standout character of the group. We have Johnny Storm, the new Human Torch. So there was a Human Torch in the golden age of comics, which eventually shows up in the Fantastic Four. Isn't mentioned when the Human Torch first shows up in the Fantastic Four, but later on they acknowledge, oh yeah, there was another Human Torch before this one. Johnny is a hot-headed teenager who, in the whole of the series, I don't think he ever gets beyond his early 20s. He's terrible with women. He has the worst luck with women, Roger. I mean, his relationships always fall apart. But his relationship with the Thing is awesome, and their relationships are great. And so going into the 1970s, we have a new artist, John Buscema. Eventually, Stan Lee, of course, leaves the book, and we have different artists. Jerry Conway comes on for a while, and Marv Wolfman comes on, and everybody, I think, wrote the Fantastic Four after a while. And the quality of the writing went up and down. One thing that did happen in the 1960s, and I noticed this with Thor as well, is that Stan Lee did repeat himself a lot. You got a lot of plots that were recycled over and over again in the Fantastic Four. And that continued into the 1970s, actually. It wasn't as bad as in Thor. You really noticed it in Thor, when Loki would trick Odin over and over again and then take over Asgard. Look, Odin was an idiot, Roger, but it was never quite that bad. But you did get a lot of the same story beats happening over and over again. And a lot of that did continue in the 1970s. It probably was less noticeable when you were reading a comic every month. I was reading the Fantastic Four every day practically, so it was much more noticeable. But overall, the quality in the 1970s was really good. And the art with John Buscema and eventually some other artists in the 1970s really maintained its quality. It was good stuff. And it was fun. the Thing very often took center stage because by this time he was, the most popular character on the book. And some things happened with this comic, and this is one of these things. Here's Medusa in the comic taking over for Sue Storm. One of the things that happened in the comic, because, they were parents, Mr. Fantastic and Sue Storm. Sue Storm had to take some time off, to have the baby. And she was replaced by Crystal of the Inhumans, and eventually Medusa from the Inhumans came on board. And one thing about the 1960s was Stan Lee was very much a man of his time. And Sue Storm she wasn't always presented all that well, if you see what I mean. She was kind of, oh, Reed, and she was sort of sometimes practically, the housewife of the group. She was just, wasn't always utilized at her best. And that's something they had to deal with going into the 1970s when times were changing. And going into the 1980s, where Sue Storm originally was the least powerful member of the group. But in the 1960s, she changed her powers in that she wasn't just invisible, she got her invisible force field. Eventually, the invisible force fields that she was able to create made her the most powerful member of the group. Although it took some time for that to happen. You start to see a little bit of that in the 1970s where it's kind of heading in that direction, but it takes a long time. The 1970s were fun. It was pretty steady as a good, entertaining comic book. A lot of good stuff happened in the 1970s. A lot of forgettable villains. A lot of old favorites came back. Doctor Doom, the greatest supervillain of all, made many appearances in the 1970s. And then we moved into the 1980s. And like at this period, we have Marv Wolfman, and Keith Pollard was on the book. And it continued to be good. And moving into the 1980s, we got, the beginnings of John Byrne starting to do some artwork. And then we had eventually John Byrne taking over the book, which was after Jack Kirby's run with Stan Lee, the greatest period of the Fantastic Four, probably. John Byrne's run was overall pretty great. And John Byrne himself, I've heard in interviews when they've asked him, what's the best thing you've ever done? He thinks the Fantastic Four was probably the best thing that he ever did. And I think he's probably right. I mean, starting off with his very first issue writing the book, it was fantastic. He spent a lot of time drawing the book for other writers, but eventually he took over the book himself. Bill Mantlo was writing the book for a bit, but eventually John Byrne took over the book, and he just did an incredible job. You could tell that he loved the characters, and he just had a kind of back to basics approach in the beginning, and just really came up with some interesting stories. It wasn't all great. The first half of John Byrne's run was a lot better, I think, than his second half. He did give Sue Storm a terrible haircut right away. She continued with terrible haircuts throughout his run. Eventually, he also gave Johnny Storm a terrible haircut. It was the 80s. I guess terrible haircuts were required. But, he had some really good stories. John Byrne has never been my favorite writer, but he's an excellent artist. but I have to say his first half on the book, let me put this over here, was, in my opinion, a lot better than the second half of his run on the book. He started to he had some ideas that didn't always, in my opinion, work. Probably the most egregious was when he took the Thing's girlfriend and had her fall in love with Johnny Storm. So Alicia Masters, who was a longtime girlfriend of the Thing, I think from issue 9 or something. She had been the Thing's girlfriend for a long, long time. So the Thing disappeared along with the rest of the Fantastic Four during, what was it? Secret Wars. And when the Fantastic Four came back from Secret Wars, the Thing decided to stay on the Secret Wars planet. And he had his own comic book at the time. And so he was replaced by She-Hulk. And so Alicia was left alone, and she fell in love with Johnny, and Johnny fell in love with her, which just seemed unrealistic and just not right. That whole thing just didn't seem right. And I was never a fan of replacing the Thing, the most popular character on the Fantastic Four, with She-Hulk. I have nothing against She-Hulk, and I get that John Byrne just really liked She-Hulk, but she's not the Thing. And I really felt it reading the Fantastic Four when the Thing isn't around, my favorite character from the group. But it was still good. It was still a really good comic book. And eventually we find out that Alicia was a Skrull the whole time, a shape-shifting alien Skrull, which made sense, because I think a lot of people kind of felt like, what the hell, Eventually, John Byrne did leave the book, and he went off to do Superman over at DC Comics. And the book wasn't as good, of course, after John Byrne left, and they were just kind of trying to figure out what they were going to do. But it was still pretty solid for a while until we got Steve Englehart. And Steve Englehart, this is the one period in the Fantastic Four which I just thought was crap. It just wasn't good when Steve Englehart was doing it, in my opinion. Not only the decisions that he made were odd, like Sue Storm, or I should say Sue Richards at this point, and Reed Richards leave the Fantastic Four to raise their kid away from danger, and Ben Grimm, the Thing, takes over the group, and he's the leader of the group. And he hires Miss Marvel to an old friend of his, Miss Marvel, the new Miss Marvel. Well, she was new at the time, to be on the Fantastic Four. Crystal rejoins the Fantastic Four. And there's another accident where Ben Grimm is hit by more cosmic rays, and the Thing becomes a giant pineapple. And I never liked this look for the Thing. I always thought it was pretty dumb. So yeah, the Thing becomes a big pineapple, but that's not the worst that happens. Miss Marvel becomes the She-Thing. They still call her Miss Marvel, out of pity, but really she's the She-Thing. Which, I want to die. Yes, so did I. So did I at this point. And oddly, for Steve Englehart, not only did he make weird decisions that in my opinion just really didn't work, but the comic book just wasn't well written. There was a whole issue full of exposition. I remember that. I think the whole issue was exposition. exposition. It was an expedition, Roger. It was exposition is the word I was looking for. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, excuse me. But it just, this period of the comic sucked. And it's the only period of the Fantastic Four which I really think just sucked. And I was happy when it was finally over. Walter Simonson, who had done such fantastic work on Thor, came on the book. And oddly enough, you would think that when Walter Simonson came on, he would, he would go back to the status quo of the original Fantastic Four. At this point, Ben Grimm had stopped being the Thing entirely, and he was just human. And there were some stupid things that happened. And Walter Simonson didn't change that status quo when he got on board the book. But the book did improve tremendously. But I've thought since reading it, it was good. He did a great job on the artwork, of course. It just didn't seem as good as it should have been with Walt Simonson on the book. It was good, which was a hell of a lot better than it was previously, but it wasn't great, And that's kind of how I feel about Walter Simonson on the book. It was good, but it wasn't great, and it wasn't as good as it should have been, I thought, after reading his Thor issues. I mean, his Thor issues were fantastic, but it was good. And the book kind of moved on from there. And going into the 90s, this ends here in 1990. Eventually, we get Tom DeFalco writing the book, and Paul Ryan comes on to illustrate the book. Paul Ryan was on the book for a long time. He was pretty much on the book until the end. And I really, really like this run, the DeFalco Paul Ryan run. This was, I had stopped reading when I was younger. I stopped reading the Fantastic Four when it came out during the whole pineapple thing era. I just couldn't handle it. And I just stopped reading the book. And I didn't pick up the book again until Paul Ryan was drawing the book. And I loved this period of the Fantastic Four. It was a lot of fun. At one point, Reed Richards disappears, which normally I would not be a huge fan of, but it's at this period, the DeFalco Ryan era, when the Invisible Woman finally becomes a much more interesting character, and she starts leading the team. She just, when Reed Richards is gone, she just takes over. Like, nobody elected her leader. She just took over. And she was fantastic in that role. And she became a really interesting character, and like a lot of fun stuff happened in the book. I really enjoyed that final era of the Fantastic Four before it was canceled for Heroes Reborn. And in the mid-90s, Marvel was kind of a mess, and a lot of their books just were not selling, and a lot of the books just were not good. Thor, when I got to the end of Thor, wow, it was pretty rough. Thor was not great by the end of the run, and a lot of books were not great at this time for Marvel. The Avengers were not very good at all. Iron Man was absolutely terrible. But there were some books that were good. Fantastic Four was good. Captain America was really good. And so instead of just, hiring some solid creative teams who respected and loved the characters like they did with Captain America and obviously already had with Fantastic Four, they just canceled them and, hired out some some creators who had abandoned Marvel earlier and gone to form Image Comics. They outsourced their major characters because they just didn't know how to write them or didn't know what to do with them. It sucked. And it sucked because the Fantastic Four was actually, pretty good at this period. And we get to the end with Onslaught, the Onslaught storyline. The last couple issues of the Fantastic Four were not illustrated by Ryan. Ryan was already gone. They were penciled by Carlos Pacheco, who did a good job on the last couple issues. But the last couple issues were all set up for Onslaught and the Fantastic Four disappearing with a bunch of other heroes from the Marvel Universe. And that was it. That was the end. Let me see if I can get the cover for that last issue. But, the last couple issues were good. This comic, the Fantastic Four, except for that one bad spot, which I thought was crap, except for that one bad spot, Fantastic Four was always at least good, if not great. The best eras were, in my opinion, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, of course, was the best. John Byrne was really, really good. And I really liked the DeFalco Paul Ryan era too. So those are my favorite eras of the Fantastic Four. But it was always at least worth reading, except for the Pineapple Thing era. But it was tremendous fun to read all of these Fantastic Four issues. It's an interesting thing when you read an entire series. This series went on for 30-something years before it was canceled, which covered a lot of time. But I was reading them, like I said, every day. So it was easy to see the changes and that were going on, the repetitions in plots occasionally, the development of the characters. And the characters actually did develop quite a bit over time. And it's a wonderful book. And it, very often, I think, probably did live up to the world's greatest comic magazine. And that's all I have to say about that. It was tremendous fun. And like I said, I am now reading Spider-Man every day. I'm reading Spider-Man every day. Gonna read the whole first run of Spider-Man, which lasted a long time. I think it was 441 issues or something. It went on for a while, so that'll be fun. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.